Hey everybody. As you may know, I'm writing a book that I'll be releasing later this summer called A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. And I'm building that book around looking at the way of Jesus versus the way of Trump. And I've already introduced two major sections of the book in recent videos: the way of peace versus the way of the demagogue, and the way of truth versus the way of the deceiver. So today, I'm introducing a third section: the way of justice versus the way of the oppressor. Now, this is all just rough draft stuff, just an introduction, and my focus today is on developing just a basic biblical understanding of justice. But in the book and in later videos in the series, I'll lay out a case for how Donald Trump is not only the most unjust American political figure of my lifetime, but he promotes a way of thinking about justice that poisons the faith of the Christians who accept it. The idea of justice is huge and it's complex, and it means many things to many different people. Some might focus on social justice issues, and some might focus on making sure that everyone gets a fair shake in the courts. And others might focus on issues around making sure that our democracy functions in a fair manner. And my contention in the book and in the videos to come is going to be that justice might have many different aspects, but Donald Trump has a lifelong track record, a track record with mountains of evidence of perverting justice in every one of those aspects. And it's not going to be a close call either. I'll use numerous publicly available examples to show that by any measure, Donald Trump perfectly fits the mold of a biblical oppressor. So when I make that case, my question for Christians is going to be, do you care? Because right now, it seems like a lot of Christians don't. And I've been asking myself for years why that is. Why don't some Christians seem to care that Donald Trump so perfectly displays all the biblical characteristics of an oppressor? Why do they go along with the charade? Why do they buy into his childish claims that he's being picked on when people try to hold him accountable for his actions? The only way that I can understand it is that for too many Christians, the political ends, namely the empowerment of our tribe, justify the means, namely supporting a man for president who's the epitome of an unjust ruler. And that leads me to this question. When Jesus tells his followers to pursue justice and righteousness, does that apply to our political life, the way that we organize our society together? Or is this whole topic beside the point for followers of Jesus? Does the Bible simply teach us that we shouldn't steal or commit fraud or bear false witness in our personal lives, but we're totally free to support a political candidate who makes those things a part of his brand? Is it okay to turn a blind eye to his injustice because he claims to be on the side of our tribe? For example, when the Bible tells us to do impartial justice in the courts, does it make an exception so we can support a man who trashes our criminal justice system when it tries to apply justice to him? And do we reward him with our votes when he makes these outlandish claims that he's on trial not for the things that he's done, but instead that he's on trial for us? Or here's another question. Does Jesus tell us to care for the poor and the immigrant, another aspect of justice, only in our personal lives, but allow us to support a candidate who tramples on those very people as a political strategy? In short, is justice only something that matters to followers of Jesus in the way that we conduct our personal life, and we can turn a blind eye to injustice outside of our own homes and workplaces and churches? Or are we called to something a little higher than that? If we want to know the answer, I think we have to start with what we even mean by justice, and that's most of what I'll be talking about today. When we examine the scriptures, we learn, first of all, that God's very nature is just. Deuteronomy 32:4 reads, "He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he. In the Hebrew Scriptures, we find two closely related terms again and again that get translated as righteousness and justice. And these terms often appear together, like in Psalm 11. For the Lord is righteous. He loves justice. The upright will see his face. So what do these words mean? Let's start with the Hebrew word zedek, which is often translated as righteousness, but sometimes it gets translated as justice. In English, we might think of righteousness in terms of moral purity, moral uprightness, and it does have that connotation, but that's only part of it. The Hebrew term implies something far more relational than we often think of. Beginning with God, the righteousness of God means that God acts consistently with his own nature. He's true to his own good nature, and his nature defines the standard for righteousness. And so for God's people, righteousness begins with being in a right relationship with God, and then living in a way that reflects his nature. In my talk on the way of peace a couple weeks ago, I mentioned the creation account and the Garden of Eden, how it shows us a picture of peace, of perfect shalom. As part of that shalom, the Garden of Eden shows us human beings living in a completely right relationship with God and with one another. That's righteousness. The relationships are intact. Everyone gives to one another what they owe in their relationships, and they joyfully participate in caring for God's creation and bringing about goodness and life. Human beings were created for this, for right relationship with God and for right relationships with one another. And that brings us to the second Hebrew word that I mentioned, mishpat. Mishpat is a way of talking about justice that gets at treating one another equitably. When we talk about law, we're talking about mishpat. When we talk about fairness, we're talking about mishpat. And this is a side of justice that we're used to talking about in the U.S. because it's grounded in our basic human rights. But before sin enters the picture, we don't really need to even think about this kind of justice because it just happens as a result of all the right relationships that everyone's experiencing. We talk about human rights now because we live in a fallen world where many people don't get to experience those rights. So we need mishpat. We need the law. We need to talk about fairness and equity because these things are being taken away from people. Without sin, we wouldn't have to talk about rights and justice because those things would be like water to a fish. They'd just be the invisible environment that we're all swimming in. So to be truly righteous means to be in right relationship with God and with everyone else. But because of sin, those right relationships have gotten severed. So we need mishpat, justice, to insist on human beings being treated according to the rights that were owed by everyone else. Simply by virtue of being human, we ought to be able to expect to be treated according to our basic human rights. And treating people equitably, according to their basic human rights, is called justice. And I think many of us in America have been so steeped in the idea of human rights, even those who might reject the words of the Bible, that we can take it for granted or overlook it. But we've got to understand where those rights come from as human beings. Otherwise, what's to stop a tyrant from declaring that some humans have rights and others don't? What's to stop a demagogue from stirring up so much hatred and division against entire groups of people that he can convince his followers that those others have somehow forfeited their human rights? We've seen this happen throughout history when a powerful person stirs up his followers against their perceived enemies. So they go along with depriving their enemies of their basic human rights. So we say we have rights, but where do these rights come from? To answer that question, we have to start at the very beginning. The creation account gives us a rock-solid basis for why we ought to treat every human being rightly. In Genesis 1:27, we read, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Now, justice is all about treating one another with the dignity and respect that they deserve as the image of God. But this was a revolutionary teaching, by the way. We might take it for granted now, but to a person reading the Genesis account back in the day, it would have been completely unexpected to say that human beings are created in the image of God or the gods. Ancient kings would often set up statues of themselves, their image, in far-off regions of their kingdom to remind their subjects that the king ruled in that area. And people who ruled an area on behalf of the king were often said to rule in the image of the king. So if someone toppled the statue of the king or harmed the one who ruled as the image of the king, this was seen as an attack on the king. To attack the image of the king is to attack the king. So human beings were placed in the creation as God's image, as the ones who tend the garden, who bring order to the creation in God's name. And we dare not mistreat the image of God. As the creator of the universe, God is the only one with rights in and of himself, but because he declares that human beings are the image of God on this earth, we're granted rights as his image. And we're given unsurpassable worth and dignity. That's why Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." Everything else that we believe about justice flows out of this understanding. And if I can point out just one more thing that may or may not be obvious, the Genesis accounts were also revolutionary in their time for how they portrayed the creation of women. Back to Genesis 1:27. "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." So right at the very beginning, we see a picture of humanity as male and female, both created in the image of God. And in Genesis 2, we see a picture of God forming the man out of the ground and then forming the animals out of the ground. But when it comes time to form the woman, God does not form her out of the ground. Instead, he forms her out of the man's rib. And this differs from many other ancient creation accounts where women are often formed in a completely different manner from men. In the biblical account, God doesn't take like a separate piece of ground to form the woman, but he forms the woman out of the man himself. They're the same substance. And the man recognizes this, and he says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And I think that it's a tragedy that some people are going to use these passages to argue that women are somehow inferior to men. And I don't want to get into all the debates about how birth order works in Genesis and the man naming the woman, because those debates obscure the beauty of the main point that's being made here. Women and men are created out of the same substance, and they're both created in the image of God. And as the image of God, they have equal, unsurpassable worth. So everything else that I'll say in future videos about justice is going to be grounded in this core understanding of men and women, human beings in the image of God. And what we'll see is that, yes, this means that we all have basic human rights and ought to be treated accordingly. Our own Declaration of Independence recognizes this when it says that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So whether one looks to the Bible as the basis for human rights or to our own founding documents, the point is the same. Human beings have certain rights that are God-given, that are outside of the reach of other human beings. We don't get to decide which human beings are worthy of receiving justice and which ones are not. We all deserve justice. So in some future talks, I'll go into what this means on the ground, and I'll be looking at several different aspects of biblical justice. For instance, on the most fundamental level, what does it mean to treat every human being as the image of God? Should that affect the way that we talk about people, for instance, including our enemies? Jesus seemed to think so. And just on this very basic understanding of what it means to do justice, to recognize the image of God in our enemies, we have to ask the question, how does Donald Trump do when held up to that standard? We're not looking for perfection, of course. I mean, we'd all fail if the standard is perfection. But part of the Christian maturity is to learn to exercise wisdom and discretion, not to just sweep away inconvenient truths by saying no one's perfect. Does it matter if Christian children watch their parents support a president who dehumanizes those who oppose him? That's the sort of question that we need to answer. And related to that, what about Donald Trump's treatment of women? If you're a Christian who plans to vote for Trump, how do you deal with these numerous proven examples of the way that he degrades and abuses women? Women are created in the image of God, and we have many examples of Donald Trump treating them as anything but. And we're going to have to look at those. We can't look away, or else we're teaching our children and our grandchildren that they should look away too. Or to take it into the legal realm, Donald Trump is currently on trial in New York City, and he has 3 more trials that may happen next year. And by the time you hear this, the New York trial will probably be finished. Now, I'm in favor of these trials, but I don't personally hold out hope that he'll be convicted in any of them, because I just can't imagine finding any jury of 12 people who are going to be able to unanimously convict such a powerful and divisive person. If they're able to, then it'll show something good about our criminal justice system. And if they unanimously find him not guilty, it'll show something good about our criminal justice system. If we can come to a unanimous agreement on something, that's fantastic. But in my view, I think that we missed our best way to hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions while he was president, which was through impeachment, because his allies in Congress came to his defense in both of those impeachment trials. But if we're going to talk about justice, we have to take a hard look at Trump's approach to the judicial system, how he talks about it when he's on trial, how he uses it when he's in power. And what we'll see is that in every circumstance, he both practices and preaches an approach to the law that serves to destroy the confidence that his followers have in the justice system. Should Christians care about that? I think so. I mean, we can't look away from a man who wants to be president, who's asking us to vote for him, and who destroys the very idea of impartial justice in this country every day. But the Bible does say so much more about justice than even that. All through the scriptures, we're told to do justice to the poor, the widow, the immigrant. As I've been studying the idea of biblical justice in preparation for these talks, one of the saddest things that I've encountered is Christian after Christian who rail against the idea of social justice as though it's somehow different from biblical justice. I mean, sure, some people who aren't followers of Jesus might define social justice differently from how I might define it, but the Bible is all about social justice as the Bible defines it. People of good faith can disagree on the details of how to best bring about justice in our society, but Christians are not allowed to pretend that it's not part of our calling. It's a central part of our calling. So I'll be looking in some future videos at what it means to do justice within our society. And I'll be looking at a bunch of examples of what Donald Trump has to say about the sorts of issues that Jesus cared about, involving the most vulnerable people among us. And I'll be asking the question, should Christians care about how their political leaders talk about justice. Even if we don't agree on exactly how we achieve it or exactly what it looks like, are we obligated to choose leaders who at least want to try, instead of using the most vulnerable among us as pawns in a culture war? So once I start fleshing out these talks on justice, that's where I'm going to be going. And I've got one or two big picture introductions like this to do first. So the next one is going to be called something like the way of love versus the way of the predator. But once I get those big picture introductions done, then I'll start building out examples of what I mean when I say the way of peace is greater than the way of the demagogue, or the way of truth is greater than the way of the deceiver, or the way of justice is greater than the way of the oppressor. My goal isn't to demonize Donald Trump or to attack the image of God in him either. But he's running for president, and the only reason that he's a viable candidate after everything the whole world has seen about him is that a whole lot of Christians support him. It's an insane situation. It's gross. And I really can't stand having to talk about this. But here we are. This is the hand that we've been dealt. And we have to deal with this stuff honestly and, truthfully, fairly, but be clear-eyed in it. We can't look away from these things. I think we're teaching our children and our grandchildren what it means to be followers of Jesus in the world by the way that we handle this. So thank you for being part of this process, and thanks for listening.